Hi everyone, welcome to Scalp Acupuncture, presented by Lamp AccuWellness Foundation, Inc. as part of its continuing Lamp Lecture series. Neuroanatomy Basics Made Easy. The skull is the bony framework of the head. It is comprised of the 8 cranial bones and 14 facial bones. Anatomical landmarks are standard reference points in the face and head used for the area locations of scalp acupuncture. These references are relatively fixed measurements, not affected by changes in appearance, such as with aging or with muscular actions. We have major anatomical divisions and landmarks on the scalp surface related to the locations and functions of scalp acupuncture. These areas are correctly located by using osseous marks on the skull. The most commonly used osseous marks are as follows. Glabella. This is the space between the eyebrows and just above the nose. It joins the 2 superciliary ridges and is slightly elevated. It is one of the main points used to measure many scalp acupuncture areas. Parietal tubercle. This is the highest part of convexity, a little caudal area in the middle of the parietal bone. It marks the speech 2 area and praxia area. External occipital protuberance is a prominence on the outer surface of the occipital bone. It is near the middle of the occipital squama. It is a landmark for locating the balance area and vision area. The scalp is the soft tissue envelope of the cranial vault. It extends from the superior nuchal line on the posterior area of the skull to the supraorbital margins. Laterally, it extends into the temporal fossa to the level of the zygomatic arches. The scalp has 5 layers. They are the skin, the connective tissue, the epicranial aponeurosis, the loose areolar tissue, and the pericranium. The first 3 layers are bound together and work as a single unit. This unit can move along the loose areolar tissue over the pericranium. The skin of the scalp is thick and contains numerous sweat and sebaceous glands, a large blood supply, and hair follicles. The connective tissue, superficial fascia, is a fibrofatty layer that connects the skin to the underlying aponeurosis of the occipitofrontalis muscle and provides a passageway for the nerves and blood vessels. The epicranial aponeurosis, the Gallia aponeurotica, is a tough layer of thick fibrous tissue that runs from the frontalis muscle anteriorly to the occipital muscle posteriorly. Laterally, it continues as the temporal fascia. The loose areolar tissue connects the epicranial aponeurosis to the pericranium and allows the 3 layers of the scalp to move superficially over the pericranium. This layer acts somewhat like a sponge because it contains innumerable potential spaces to provide an easy plane of separation between the upper 3 layers and the pericranium. The loose areolar tissue, which lies approximately 5.7 millimeters or 0.22 inch from the surface on most adults, is the correct layer into which the needle should be inserted for scalp acupuncture. The pericranium is the periosteum of the skull bones and provides nutrition to the bone and capacity for repair. The human nervous system contains two parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord. And the peripheral nervous system consists of sensory neurons, clusters of neurons called ganglia, and nerves connecting them to each other and to the central nervous system. The developing brain consists of three main divisions: the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. The forebrain is the largest part of the nervous system in humans and is further subdivided into two other areas: the telencephalon and the diencephalon. The telencephalon is made up of the cerebral hemispheres, including the cerebral cortex, white matter, and basal ganglia. The diencephalon is composed of the midbrain is a relatively short and narrow region connecting the forebrain and the hindbrain. The hindbrain consists of the pons and the cerebellum together with the medulla. The midbrain, pons, and medulla together form a connection between the forebrain and the spinal cord and are referred to as the brainstem. Major parts of the central nervous system, made up of myelinated axons, are called white matter. Areas made up mainly of cell bodies are known as gray matter. Most of the local synaptic communication between neurons in the central nervous system occurs in the gray matter, while axons in the white matter transmit signals over greater distances. A unique mantle of gray matter called the cerebral cortex covers the surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Beneath this lies the white matter, which sends signals to and from the cortex. Gray matter is also found in large clusters of cells called nuclei, located deep within the cerebral hemisphere and brainstem, such as the basal ganglia and thalamus. The cerebral cortex has numerous crevices called sulci. The ridges of cortex that rise up between the sulci are called gyri. The cerebral hemispheres have four major lobes: the frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital. The frontal lobes are in the front of the brain and extend backward to the central sulcus. The frontal lobes are separated inferiorly and laterally from the temporal lobes. The parietal lobes are bounded anteriorly by the central sulcus, but have no pointed demarcation from the temporal lobes or the occipital lobes. When studied from the side of the brain, the parietal lobes and occipital lobes are divided by the parieto-occipital sulcus. In addition to these four major lobes, another area of the cerebral cortex is located within the depths of the sylvian fissure, called the insular cortex. The two cerebral hemispheres are divided at the midline by the interhemispheric fissure. The corpus callosum, a large C-shaped band of white matter, connects homologous areas in the two hemispheres. The nervous system receives, integrates, and transmits sensory stimuli. It generates motor activity, coordinates movements, and also regulates emotions and consciousness. In general, it controls all the activities that preserve the individual and the species. The primary motor cortex lies in the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. This area controls movement of the opposite side of the body. Lesions occurring primarily in the motor cortex produce contralateral paralysis and or weakness with respect to the lesion. Motor control involves a delicate balance between multiple parallel pathways and recurrent feedback loops such as the cerebellum and basal ganglia. The cerebellum and basal ganglia act by modulating the output of the corticospinal and other descending motor systems. Both the cerebellum and basal ganglia receive major input from the motor cortex. They in turn project back to the motor cortex via the thalamus. Motor and sensory pathways are usually organized topographically. This means that adjoining areas on the motor surfaces are mapped to adjacent fibers in white matter pathways and adjacent regions of the cortex. For example, the primary motor and somatosensory cortex regions representing the foot are adjacent to regions representing the leg. These somatotopic maps on the cortex are at times called the motor or sensory homunculus. A homunculus is a physical representation of the anatomical division of the primary motor cortex and the primary somatosensory cortex. It is a projection of the parts of the body on the motor and sensory cortical areas and an upside-down representation of the human body, with the foot at the most superior position of the cortex and the face at the more inferior position. The proportion of the homunculus in the human brain is directly related to the movement and sensation of the rest of the body. For example, the lips, hands, and feet have more motor neurons than other parts of the body. So the homunculus has correspondingly large lips, hands, and feet. A part of the body with fewer motor or sensory connections to the brain is represented as appearing smaller. The primary somatosensory cortex is located in the postcentral gyrus of the parietal lobe and is involved with the sensations of the opposite side of the body. Somatic sensations refer to the perceptions of touch, pain, temperature, pulsation, and proprioception, which is the sense of limb or joint position. The key input to this area arises from the ventral posterior nuclei of the thalamus, a somatotopically arranged protrusion in the form of a sensory homunculus. Like the motor homunculus, the body's distorted and uneven representation in the sensory homunculus is also based upon the relative densities of innervation. The lips, tongue, sex organs, and thumb have a larger representative area in domain somatosensory cortex. The primary visual cortex is located in the occipital lobes along the bands of a deep sulcus called the calcarine fissure. It is highly specialized for processing information about static and moving objects and pattern recognition. The primary visual cortex receives visual inputs from the opposite visual field. Thus, the left half of the visual field of each eye is mapped to the right primary visual cortex. The primary auditory cortex lies in the posterior half of the superior temporal gyrus and also enters into the lateral sulcus as the transverse temporal gyri. Sound reaching the primary auditory cortex is less lateralized and represents more of a mixture of input from both ears. The primary auditory cortex is responsible for processing auditory information and performs the basic functions of hearing, pitch, and volume. Language abilities are located in the association areas of the parietal temporal occipital complex, typically in the left hemisphere. Broca's area associates to language production, and Wernicke's area relates to understanding language. Broca's area is located in the frontal lobe, adjacent to the areas of the primary motor cortex responsible for moving the lips, tongue, face, and larynx. Linguistic rules and grammar, syntax, and the template for phonation are created, and speech, melody, and rhythm are regulated within Broca's area. Damage in Broca's area usually causes deficits in the construction of language. Wernicke's area is located in the posterior section of the superior temporal gyrus. It is involved in understanding both written and spoken language. Language is usually perceived first by the primary auditory cortex in the superior temporal lobe when we are listening, or by the primary visual cortex in the occipital lobe when we are reading. From either the primary auditory cortex or the primary visual cortex, association fibers convey information to Wernicke's area. Damage in Wernicke's area often causes deficits in language comprehension. The thalamus is located between the cerebral cortex and midbrain, above the brainstem and behind the basal ganglia. The thalamus is a major relay center. Nearly all pathways that project to the cerebral cortex do so after synapsing in the thalamus. Its function includes integrating and modifying the sensory and motor inputs and selectively tuning up the output signals to the cerebral cortex. Conscious awareness of pain, basic touch, temperature, and pressure sensations may all occur at the thalamic level. The thalamus also processes information that influences the electrocortical activity of sleep and alertness. It is involved in consciousness and the adjustment of the affective component of behavior. The hypothalamus is situated beneath the thalamus, just above the brain stem. The hypothalamus is an important region in the human brain and is involved in many different functions, such as control of the autonomic, neuroendocrine, limbic, and other bodily circuits. The hypothalamus synthesizes and secretes neurohormones, and these in turn regulate the secretion of pituitary hormones. The hypothalamus is responsible for both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. The hypothalamus is concerned with the reception and integration of sensory impulses from the internal organs and is the principal intermediary between the nervous and endocrine systems. Additionally, the hypothalamus controls appetite, thirst, fatigue, thermoregulation, the sleep-wake cycle, and sexual desire. The pituitary gland lies within the pituitary fossa and is linked to the bottom of the hypothalamus through the pituitary stalk. The pituitary gland is composed of an anterior and a posterior lobe. The anterior lobe synthesizes and secretes the following 6 hormones: adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, growth hormone, GH, thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, luteinizing hormone, LH, and follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. ACTH stimulates the adrenal cortex to produce corticosteroid hormones that are important for maintaining correct blood pressure, controlling electrolyte balance, and promoting glucose mobilization in the bloodstream. TSH stimulates the thyroid gland to produce thyroxine, T4, and triiodothyronine, T3, which promote cellular metabolism. Growth hormone stimulates growth in childhood and maintains a healthy body composition and well-being in adults. Prolactin stimulates the mammary glands to produce milk after childbirth to enable nursing and affect sex hormone levels of the ovaries in women and the testes in men. LH regulates estrogen in women and testosterone in men. FSH promotes sperm production in men and stimulates the ovaries to enable ovulation in women. The posterior lobe stores and releases 2 hormones: oxytocin and vasopressin. Oxytocin controls the smooth muscles to contract in the breast for milk letdown to take place, and it controls contractions of the uterus during labor. Vasopressin regulates osmolarity and water in the body. The pineal gland is an endocrine gland located near the center of the brain, between the 2 hemispheres, tucked in a groove where the 2 thalamic bodies join. The pineal gland secretes a melanocyte-stimulating hormone, which plays a pain-relieving role due to its endorphin content. It also secretes melatonin and other enzymes that show sensitivity to variations in diurnal light and circadian rhythms. In addition, it influences the secretion of the gonadotropic hormones that maintain a regulatory role in reproductive development. Through these hormones, the pineal gland may exert a regulatory role by modifying the actions of the pituitary, adrenal, and parathyroid glands, as well as the gonads. Several structures in the brain are referred to collectively as the limbic system because they are located near the inner border of the cortex. It comprises the medial and anterior temporal lobes, anterior insula, prefrontal lobes, cingulate gyri, hippocampal formation, amygdala, hypothalamus, certain thalamic nuclei, epithalamus, pineal gland, septal area, basal ganglia, and brainstem. The limbic system has a direct influence on autonomic, neuroendocrine, and behavior mechanisms. It maintains homeostasis, integrates the olfactory impulses, and plays a role in sexual arousal. The limbic system is associated with emotion and motivation. The cerebral cortex contains a large quantity of association cortices that carry out higher order information processing. Any one association cortex is mostly located adjoining its primary area. The parietal, temporal, and occipital association cortices are all located in the posterior part of the primary cortices, which organize functions from multiple sensory and motor modalities. The frontal and prefrontal association cortices are involved in planning actions, movements, and abstract thought. The frontal lobes are the largest hemispheres and contain immense areas of association cortices involving the cognitive functions and personality. They are associated with reward, attention, planning, long-term memory, and drive. The prefrontal cortex is located in front of the premotor cortex, a well-developed area in the human brain. The prefrontal cortex plays an important role in the establishment of emotional responses, programming, and intellectual functions. Lesions in the frontal lobes cause a range of disorders in personality and cognitive functioning. Patients with frontal lobe lesions may have particular difficulty when asked to execute a sequence of repeated actions or to change from one activity to another. Personality changes caused by frontal lobe lesions can consist of impaired judgment, a cheerful lack of concern about one's illness, inappropriate joking, and other uninhibited behaviors. The parietal lobe consists of the postcentral gyrus and is divided into a superior and inferior parietal lobule. The parietal lobe is concerned with knowledge of numbers and their relations, manipulation of objects, imitation of speech or action, imitation of gestures without words, and copying. Damage in the inferior parietal lobule in the left hemisphere often causes difficulty with calculations, confusion with right-left orientation, an inability to identify fingers by name, and problems with written language. Damage in the front of the left parietal lobe may cause difficulty with motor conceptualization, planning, and execution. The parietal lobes also have an important role in spatial awareness. Damage in the parietal lobe often produces distortion of perceived space and neglect of the contralateral side. The supplementary motor area is located in the medial frontal gyri, which form the medial extension of the superior frontal gyrus above the cingulate one. This area exhibits a small motor homunculus that operates autonomously from the primary motor cortex. The supplementary motor cortex regulates the rhythm and strength of contraction of the muscles. It mediates contraction of postural muscles on both sides. It is also associated with the planning and initiation of movements. Damage in the supplementary motor cortex causes an increase in flexor muscle tone, leading to spasmodic contraction. The cerebellum is located at the bottom of the brain in the occipital lobe, underneath the cerebral cortex and underneath the pons. The cerebellum is divided into two large hemispheres. The cerebellum coordinates motor activities and eye movements, controls equilibrium, and regulates phonation. It also plays an important role in motor planning. Lesions in the cerebellum often cause complications in coordination and balance, referred to as ataxia. The brainstem is composed of the midbrain, the pons, and medulla. It is the lower part of the brain, adjoining and continuous with the spinal cord. Cranial nerves 3 to 12 arise from the brainstem, and all information passing between the cerebral hemispheres and the spinal cord must go through the brainstem. The brainstem plays an important role in the regulation of cardiac function, respiratory function, and the sleep cycle. It also is important in maintaining consciousness and regulating the central nervous system. Reviewing the anatomy of the cerebral blood vessels is crucial because vascular diseases or accidents in the central nervous system cause most neurological disorders. Knowing about the blood supply to the brain is essential in performing and interpreting angiographic imaging, understanding the damage associated with vascular accidents, developing a treatment strategy and plan, and evaluating scalp acupuncture treatment. There are two pairs of arteries that carry the blood supply to the brain and one pair of draining veins. The inner carotid arteries maintain the blood supply to the anterior and middle cerebral cortices, while the vertebrobasilar arteries maintain the blood supply to the posterior cerebral cortex. Because of the importance of brain functions, the vascular supply to the brain is rich with collateral vessels. The anterior and posterior blood supplies from the carotid and vertebrobasilar systems join together in an anatomic ring at the base of the brain called the circle of Willis. The main arteries supplying the cerebral hemispheres arise from the circle of Willis. The arteries supplying the brainstem and the cerebellum with blood also come from the vertebral and basilar arteries. These refer to the superior, anterior inferior, and posterior inferior cerebellar arteries. Venous drainage for the brain is maintained by superficial and deep cerebral veins. The superficial veins include the superior and inferior cerebral, superficial middle cerebral, and anastomotic veins. The superficial veins drain blood from the cerebral cortex and medulla and open into the nearby sinuses. The deep cerebral veins are composed of the internal cerebral veins, great cerebral vein of Galen, basal, and occipital veins. The deep cerebral veins drain blood from inside the hemispheres and join nearby sinuses. The functions of the brain rely completely upon the nutrition and oxygen continually supplied by blood because the brain has no storage capacity for energy material. The human brain is approximately 2% of total body weight, yet it receives 15 to 20% of cardiac output, equivalent to 750 ml per minute. When the cerebral blood supply is deficient or blocked, the brain tissue may develop hypoxia and ischemia, which in turn cause general or localized symptoms and signs in the central nervous system. Thank you very much for your attention, and please join us again in our next video.